Hello, good morning. Today our guest is David Becker. Hello, David Becker. How are you doing?
Very good, thank you. And you?
I'm great. I'm awesome because I've been looking forward to this interview for a long time. So today we will be discussing three of your important articles. Why do Finns, Estonians, and Finno-Ugric peoples in Russia have such high intelligence? The
Mhm.
second piece is Flynn effect and economic growth. Do national increases in intelligence lead to increases in GDP growth? And the last piece is cognitive sex differences, evolution and history. So we'll be
Mhm.
starting by talking about Finnish people and
Mhm.
Estonians in Russia. Why do they have such high intelligence? David, so this is my first question. What is the relationship between the climate and the intelligence of these groups?
I think it's a very difficult topic, and I'm not really sure if the climate is behind the better results of, for example, Finns and Estonians today, for example, in the PISA tests or in all school assessment tests, because compared to, for example, Russians, because they have the same climate. Yeah, if you compare them to Slavic Russians or you compare them to Swedes or to Latvians, for example, they have mostly the same climatic conditions. So I don't think that these differences have anything to do or many much to do with climatic differences. Maybe it's in their evolutionary history, because especially Finno-Ugric people are very or partly different from the normal European population. The normal population is Indo-European, and the Finno-Ugric is Finno-Ugric, and they are more connected genetically to the Chinese people, to the Han Chinese people, or to the Eastern Northeast Asian people. So maybe that has an effect. I don't know really, because it's a little bit difficult because when you compare Finns and Estonians genetically, you will see that Estonians have a lot of common with their Indo-European neighbors, and Finns not. But you also have the same or nearly the same level of intelligence and level of achievement in international school assessment studies. When you ask about, for example, the general effect of climate, I think maybe you heard about this cold winters theory.
Yes.
It's, Richard Lynn talks about, a lot about this. There are also some other theories, the RK selection theory or the differential K theory. These theories say that the harsher climate, not only the harsher climate in northern hemispheres or in more distant to the equatorial area, have an effect on intelligence, but also the changing seasons, because one living in such an area where you have winter time, then summertime, where you can, for example, can grow crops and other food, and then you have to plan across the winter to survive until the next spring or summer, when you have to bring out the new crops and so on. So you're in a circle and you have to predict these situations. First, you have to predict the situation because it's cold and you have rare resources. And second, you can predict because you have this cycle of seasons. This is the cold winters theory. I think it's a theory you can. Yeah, partly I confirm this theory, or I would agree to this theory, but I don't think that will answer the whole question.
Yeah, the cold winter theory is really fascinating, but I think it needs to be refined. However, I do know that some studies show a positive relationship between the environment and well-being. Cold climates, according to some research, predict favorable well-being and income in America, at least.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, we have a bad situation on the planet because it's not so good for research, because would we have equally distributed countries in the northern and southern hemisphere, we could test this just to look at the southern hemisphere and see if the intelligence or the abilities increased with the distance from the equator. unfortunately, we don't have this. Yeah, there are some countries. I think we have South Africa. I don't see the same pattern in Africa, so that we have an increase from the distance from the equator. But in Africa, it's a little bit problem because the results we have from sub-Saharan Africa are less valid. I don't want to say that they are completely wrong, but I have to say that are less valid than results from Europe and Asia. And it's also because you have a lot of migration and population movement in Africa in younger times. For example, the Bantu people, which reached Southern Africa, I think, in the 1700s or 1800s. So it's not long ago. At the same time, we have some countries, for example, in Southern America, but they are colonized countries. So we don't have the same history, population history in the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere. We also have less countries in the southern hemisphere, so we can compare these and searching of the pattern.
Yeah, I was going to say go ahead, but I'm just going to make a quick point. So, David, are you familiar with the research of Leon and absolute latitude? That's a new area of research. Yes, I'm glad that you said yes. I've been reading some of his papers, and Rinderman has also commented on the issue. Would you like to tell us a little about it, just briefly?
Yeah, as I said, this cold winter theory could explain a part, but I think there are some other parts which are also connected to, or some other factors which are also connected to climate. For example, parasite load. So the amount of parasites, of viruses, and so on in the different climatic regions. Because there is I think it's called, not the investment theory, but it is a kind of investment theory. I think it's original from Satoshi Kanazawa. It's a Japanese
Satoshi Kanazawa, proximity from Africa.
Yeah. And he said that the human body, when it's developed, have to focus on different aspects. He want to invest his resources. And when you are in an environment which is very strong, loaded by parasites and so on, the body have to focus on things like the immune system. And these resources are, they have a lack of resources you can invest in the cognitive development. That's another part. Different parts are also that when you live in a northern hemisphere or more northern environment, maybe that boosts your cultural development. So you have to do more to try to develop new technologies and so on, and that over a long time will predict or will increase your wealth, and that's where we hear. For example, there are some interesting historical studies from Europe, where you say that when you compare, for example, the Germanic people and the Roman people, you have
Germanic people and who?
And the Romans.
Okay.
And so the Mediterranean people, you have a different system of society. For example, for the agriculture, that the feudal system, for example, in the Middle Ages, which depends or which originated from the Germanic tribe system, focused on cooperation. So you are a part of the society when you can cooperate, when you can contribute with your abilities to this system. Whereas the Mediterranean are more connected on family, on relationship, and the agriculture is mostly, especially in the Roman Empire, it's mostly based on slaves. So you have these differences, and some people say that this was the reason why Europe started with the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and so on, because we had a more effective agricultural system. So I think overall, I would say there are many factors which could be seen as related to climatic conditions, and from this point, I can't say which of this is wrong or right, or which factors contributes more than the others.
Yeah, but David, I like your point in relation to the parasitic law, because At the present, I like your point in relation to the parasitic stress perspective, because at the present moment, the evidence is pointing in that direction. And parasitic load is also correlated with lower levels of innovation and collectivism and lower levels of democracy.
Yeah, but for example, you have also cultures in dry areas, in deserts, and so on, and they have a less parasitic load than in Central Europe, for example, where we have some cases of malaria until the Middle Ages and the later time. So also when you compared Arctic people, for example, you see that Arctic people have a relatively high IQ, maybe an equal IQ to European persons, maybe a little bit less, but they have a lot or less parasite load than Central Europe. So maybe it's a factor, but not the only one.
Yeah, it's not the only factor, but it's proven to be one of the more potent factors.
Interestingly, because we have this, we talk about this paper about Finns, Estonians, and so on. Interestingly, I think there was a work of Grigoriev and Lynn in 2015 or 16, which compared provinces in the Tsaristic Russia in 1900. And even in this time, you see that the Estonians have the highest literacy rate of all provinces or all regions in the Russian Empire. And the second are the Latvians and or the Livonians, which is now part of Estonia and Latvia. So you already have 100 years ago a very high alphabetic rate. And these countries are today even better in education than all others.
Yes.
It might be a cultural problem or a cultural phenomenon. What's really interesting in this part is that when you look at Estonians and Finns, you have absolutely different or a strong difference in their history, in their younger history. You have the Estonians, which are under socialist rule. You have the Finns, which are not under socialist rule. Okay, both are Protestant countries, but religion doesn't really matter in Estonia. They have also different school systems, but they gained nearly the same scores in international school assessment studies. So this is the real fascinating point here at this time. So we have two different countries which have the same or similar culture and similar ethnic background, and they scored the same. So that's the interesting part of it.
Yes, and what is interesting about Finland is that despite its unusually high level of intelligence, when we compare countries based on their ability to win Nobel Prizes, Finland is not at the top. And Edward Dutton has written on the topic, and during one of my earlier conversations, we rehashed the issue a bit, and he argues that it is partly genetic. Do you agree?
I would agree. I would overall agree that's partly genetic. The question is how strong it is. I think that has maybe less to do with intelligence. But and I think that is also the opinion of Edward Dutton. It has also to do with impulsivity or impulsiveness. And I think this is also when you, for example, when you look to China and Korea, you also have relatively less Nobel Prizes when you compare them to the higher IQs they have compared to Europeans. My opinion is that in Europe, in the Indo-European part of Europe, not Finland, Estonia by side, in this part you have a good balance of relatively high intelligence compared to the world and relatively high impulsivity. You have not so much collectivism, for example, as in China. So you have a good balance between these two factors. So you have the ability to make new technologies, and you have also the willingness to make new technologies to confront yourself with risks and so on. That's maybe I think that's a good theory. It's difficult to validate this hypothesis, but I think it's a good theory. It's also very interesting when you look at the today's situation. I think one third of all patents. I think it's the English pronunciation, so inventions. Yeah? One third came from Europe, one third came from mostly USA, also some Canada, and one third came from Japan. And you have see also higher impulsivity or impulsiveness in Japan compared to China. So they are also ethical different to China and Korea. And you have the highest IQ, I think one of the highest IQ in Japan, and you have a higher impulsiveness. And also, for example, Jewish people have a higher impulsiveness, and that's maybe the reason why they are so successful in science and technology and philosophy and culture and so on.
And this is a point that I cannot belabor enough. And recently, I read a new article informing us that individualism is the most robust cultural predictor of economic performance and innovation, and Western countries are more individualistic.
There were some papers, I think 2012 and 13 from, it's not from the common bubble of researchers you have for intelligence research, for example. Let me remind, I think the one person named Shao was a Chinese scientist, and Wei was the another. No, Shao and Plesinski was the one paper, and Wei was another paper, who showed that genetic markers which are associated with individualism and collectivism, that they are higher in Europe than in Africa. So in terms to collectivism, and higher to in Asia to Europe. So you have a continuum from high impulsiveness in African countries, also in Middle Eastern countries, with lesser impulsiveness, but just enough impulsiveness in Europe, and much strong collectivism in Asia. So maybe, and when you look at IQ, you have the same global pattern, but in another direction. And so Europe would at the center where impulsiveness is high enough and intelligence is high enough.
Yes, so David, in the article that we're discussing now, the intelligence of Finnish people and Estonians, I would like to read a snippet. And in the snippet, the researchers quote Kenya Kura. The point of this is to explain why Finnish people and East Asians may be less likely to attain the Nobel Prize. An explanation for this anomaly has been proposed by Kura et al. 2015. In attempting to understand Japan's low per capita level of science Nobel Prizes, they highlight the nature of genius. They argue that geniuses tend to be responsible for science Nobel Prizes and intellectual innovation more broadly. They conclude that geniuses combine exceptional IQ with moderately low conscientiousness and agreeableness. In other words, high psychoticism in
Yes.
in Eisenach's classification of personality. This unusual psychological profile means that they can think outside the box, yet intelligently, which allows them to have original, groundbreaking ideas. They are also low in empathy, low in altruism, or both. Kura, analyzing population gene frequencies associated with social complexity, social anxiety, and social conformity, argued that Northeast Asians are considerably higher than Europeans on these. That these gene forms are negatively associated at the national level with science Nobels and other markers of scientific genius, and that of their European samples, Finns are the closest to Northeast Asian in terms of in terms of these gene frequencies.
Yes. Yes. Problem is when you see this also in this paper that it's depend on which countries you observe. these gene frequencies, it's mostly here, for example, the haplogroups, the Y haplogroups N, which is strongly connected to O, which is predominantly in China. You can see this a correlation, but as maybe when we have two less cases to make a valid quantitative analysis. So you have Estonia, Finland, and you also have these provinces in Russia. But the part of the amount of Finno-Ugric people in these provinces is relatively low. So it's difficult to make these such a quantitative analysis. But but overall, I agree with Kenya Kura about the meaningfulness of social conformity, or not of impulsivity to the scientific outcome. I want to say one thing. The problem with these patents in today is that it's difficult to see which of these patents are new technologies or interventions or just improvements of old technologies. And maybe you know the name Woodley of Many.
Yes, yes.
Yes, and also some other people talk about this and say that the age of innovation is
over.
Is over. Yes, the age of innovation is around between 18 and 1900, where all the new inventions were done. And all what we have after this is just improvements or combinations. And when you look at, for example, when you look at Europe, we also have the, strong differences. For example, you have the Protestant countries around the Netherlands, for example, or the German Rhineland. There you have this and also London, also in the southern UK. This is the point of gravity where or most of the inventions came from. The other parts of Europe, also from Germany, some parts show less innovation power in these times. So it's maybe focused on a small group. And interestingly, also the Netherlands have a relatively high IQ.
And in your paper detailing the intelligence in Finnish and Estonian communities, Edward, and you also addressed the issue of suicide. So suicide is often correlated with intelligence, but when you were studying the Finnish people, you did not observe a clear-cut relationship. Why is this so?
It's difficult because I think this is suicide. Maybe a confounder effect, because the suicide rates are increasing automatically if you go to northern areas where there is less light, because less light makes you depressive. And also the increase in alcohol consumption is very high in these countries. So maybe it's more, let's say, yes, more a kind of climatic factor. That you have less sunlight, you are more depressive, drinking more alcohol, for example, and kill yourself. It's problematic. I think it's a problematic factor. You need, what you would need is people which are living on the same climatic conditions now from different areas of the world, and then compare them. That would be a good part. So we have, for example, when you have a sample of people from living in central Germany, which are from Estonia, from Finland, from Sweden, and so on, then you find the same pattern to confirm this hypothesis. But I think it's not possible in a cross-national study.
Yeah, but and this is one of the reasons why I find the paper so fascinating, because many results are confounding the previous orthodoxy. It's just unfortunate that papers like this are not discussed in the mainstream.
I have to say one limitation. I don't know if we write this in this paper because it's some times ago. I looked at them, for example, from the PISA study. Sometimes they published results from the regional level. For example, in Estonia, it was from, I think, 2006. Right now in Germany it was 2006, in Estonia is I think 2012. And when you look at the results in the different counties of Estonia, in the PISA studies, for example, you will see that it's only the capital, Tallinn, where around, I think, 1/3 of the population lives. It's a small country and all live in this one, or the most 1/3 live in this one capital. They outperformed the rest of Europe. But when you look at the other counties of Estonia, you found equal or lower results compared to the rest of Europe, or for example, compared to Germany. So I don't think if these PISA scores are, or I think that when you use the school assessment scores, which we also used in these national IQ studies, it's combined between psychometric measurements and school assessment studies. When you use these school assessment scores, you have to correct them of urbanization, because urban city or urban areas mostly outperform rural areas. You see the same in China, for example. And China has extreme good results in PISA and TIMSS and so on, but they only participate with some urban areas, for example, not Singapore, Beijing and Hong Kong and Yanzheng, I think it's the third. So you have also, well, these people are scored so high in PISA and TIMSS and so on because the people came only from urban areas, which outperform the rural areas. So we have not really a national representative sample. Maybe in future, maybe it will be improved in future. But all what I say is that you have to be a little bit careful with these PISA scores, with these small PISA scores. You have to correct them about certain conditions.
David?
Yeah.
Yeah, so for example, in relationship to PISA, this is a tangential point. It's not directly related to our conversation, but I've always wondered that it would be a good idea to track the best performing students in the developing world and compare them to the best performing students in Finland. So for example, you could identify the top schools in Nigeria or Jamaica or anywhere else in the developing world and then compare the performance of these students with their Finnish and Estonian or Singaporean counterparts.
Yeah, it's a really good idea. And may you know that I continue the project of Richard Lynn and Teddy Van Han about the national IQs. I am currently working on a completely new one of these analysis or this data collection of national IQs. And what I see when I look into these samples, there are also, or partly you have samples from developing countries, which are from universities of these developing countries. For example, I remember of one sample from Turkey, which is from undergraduate students. And I'm extremely surprised that they scored extremely low. They scored below.
Which country is this? Which country?
Turkey. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was in contact with the author of the study and asked her if they make some restrictions or methodological decisions which could lead to a decrease of IQ in the sample. But they can't confirm this. And yes, I was really, really surprised that the students, or that the students in developing countries which visiting universities are on the same level than the average European people, or the average German people. That was really interesting because mostly they learned, or they have to learn the same stuff, and they have to compete on a global level where all people are measured on the same scale. So that was really surprising for me. And this also shows that it's very difficult to collect samples which you can which are good comparable, because when you look at you only took this from to come back to the topic of urban and rural areas. It's not it's the case that, or it's true that you find mostly higher IQs in urban areas compared to rural areas in developing countries. But it's not the same, for example, when you look at Germany, because in Germany, in the urban areas, there are mostly the workers and unemployed people, and also many immigrants, where those with higher wealth and more better abilities, which are more successful in life, they go to the rural areas and live there. So it's really difficult to find samples you can very good compare.
Yes, and David, another issue that you touch on in the piece is the relationship between migration and intelligence. So, for example, it is said that the Finno-Ugrian peoples were more intelligent, migrated, and when they migrated, they adopted the native language and customs of the host country, and this can partially explain the decline in intelligence in some regions.
Yeah, yeah, that's not that's a common problem not only for Finland and Estonia, but all former or former how do you say, Eastern Bloc countries. Also Poland and Czechia and also Latvia. Latvia lost 1/3 of its population since the Iron Curtain was formed. And these people are mostly educated people. So this is a big problem for these countries, not only because they lost their best people, but also they invest a lot of money in education to train their people. But then when they finished, they move to a foreign country and contribute to their economy and not for the economy of their home country. So they have not only a brain drain, when you would call it in this way, but also they have money drain or education money drain. That's very problematic. You have also and it's not only tragic. Yeah, when you will also look to other European countries, that's a very funny or very tragic, because when you are against mass immigration, they call you a racist and they call you egoistic and so on. But in reality, they are the egoistic people, because they took these talented people from other countries in their own countries and let they contribute to the economy there. But the countries where they come from, they lost their cognitive ability. For example, when you are looking for in Eastern European countries like Romania and Bulgaria, they have extremely lack of physicians. They're not enough because they're all working in
They lack
Germany.
what? They lack what?
Physicians, hospitals.
Okay.
They have a lot of for in healthcare and so on. Personal healthcare. They all moved or worked in Germany and France and Great Britain, and they have a lack of these people in Romania and Bulgaria, and that's damaged their health system extremely. So from a realistic point, it's egoistic for a Western country to let talented immigrants in, then keep them outside.
Yes, and David, during our earlier discussion, we are talking about genetics, and at the time, I did not remember to tell you that some genes are correlated with novelty, and these frequencies are higher in Western populations.
Yes, maybe it's as you also say the same. We made some studies about this. For example, I made a study with Heiner Mindermann. I think you talked with him some weeks ago.
No, I haven't spoken to Einer Rinderman, but I'm familiar with his work.
Also, okay, yeah. We made a paper about haplogroups, Y haplogroups, so genetic markers mostly used in population genetics and intelligence. And we look if the differences in the genetic differences estimated from these haplogroups between two countries, when these differences increased, if their intelligence differences also increased. And we could confirm this. We could not only confirm this, but only showed that this is mostly the case when you, for genetic variances which are occurred on the north-south axis, but not when you look at the west-east axis. So intelligence was associated to genetic markers when they are associated to the north-south gradient. So that's also maybe a confirmation of the cold winters theory. And I also found in some work I done in parallel to this study, I think it's in the supplemented material of this study from 2016, I published with Hein Rinnemann, that when you look at these haplogroups, you see a switch from a negative association to a positive association with intelligence. At this point, in this phylogenetic tree of haplogroups, when the last glacial maximum, so the ice age, was happened. And that would confirm the cold winters theory, because Richard Lynn, for example, say that these differences in intelligence occurred during the ice age, to the last ice age. That would confirm this theory. But yeah, it's difficult to confirm this, because most data are not available.
And there is a recent study making similar assertions to what was purported by Ewan Rinderman, but this writer looked at the relationship between the Ice Age and the Neolithic Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
But so far, the most impressive perspective seem to be the parasitic perspective and cold winters. Most people seem to be doing research along these lines.
Yeah, it's also interesting because the parasite load also increased by the Neolithic Revolution, because population density increased, people living in steady settlements and so on, and then the parasite load increased. So usually you must have a decrease in intelligence from hunter-gatherer cultures to Neolithic or to agricultural people. And I think it was it Michael Woodley who found this? I think yes, he found some pattern that people from the pre-Neolithic, for the pre-agricultural cultures have higher loads of genes which are positively associated with intelligence. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that we published a paper about it.
Yeah. Michael Woodley of Meany did the studies on the relationship between Holocene variants and intelligence and haplogroups in Europe.
I think he done some studies.
Yeah. Michael Woodley of Meany is somewhat of a pioneer in this field. But the last point that we're going to discuss in relation to this paper is the relationship between industrialization and intelligence among Finnish population. So in the paper, it was theorized that maybe intelligence is as a result of industrialization, but the conclusion is that this is not so. Intelligence is a consequence of long-term evolutionary developments.
I would say the opposite. Industrialization is bad for intelligence, because with industrialization you have more resources, more wealth. Especially the infant mortality or the mortality in general decreased. So you have more survivors. You don't need a lot of intelligence to survive, because you have some taxpayers who will pay for you when you are not have the abilities. So starting the industrial revolution and industrialization needs intelligence, but industrialization itself has, from an evolutionary perspective, would have a negative effect on intelligence. And you are right. For example, Finland, they are starting their industrialization very, very, very late. So I think in the mid 20th century. And now we have, and that's interesting. Now we also have in Finland a decrease in cognitive ability when you measured it by school assessment studies. So PISA was a long time the first or the ranked at the best country in Europe, but now is on the second place because Estonia moved on. But you see in long term, you see a steady decline in school assessment results in Finland.
uh, David, at some point I will have a speaker on this show discussing the relationship between industrialization and mutational load. But
Mm.
presently, the data indicate that industrialization, although it has the propensity to improve living standard, it selects against intelligence and in some cases even pro-sociality.
Yeah, yeah, that's yeah, especially the last pro-sociality. When you go, when a person becomes very pro-social, when it's depend on other people. When you are living in a society where you know that this guy or you can only survive if you cooperate with the other guy or the other woman and so on, then you are then you are building this social bonds and and become very pro-social. But especially in a welfare state, and that's my theory. In a welfare state, people no longer recognize from where the money comes from. They see it, okay, the government pays for me, but they don't think or they don't know or forget that this money was paid by working peoples, by their neighbors and yeah, other people in the country. So they lost the yeah, they could not track back where the money comes from, and this also leads to a stronger antisocial behavior. And also, if you that's also my theory, then when you live in a society which is strong differentiated, yeah, with many subgroups and sub populations, you can do harm to another group or another person without having the fear to get harmed by yourself. Um, and when you live in a small homogeneous society, for example, the best part is the Greek city-states, the polis in the antique world. When someone harms his society, he harms himself because
Yeah,
he has no options to go to another group or to another location where he is safe. And today this is not so. And I feel this especially in Germany because I live in here. I see that people get more and more and more antisocial against each other, especially when they are in different groups.
yeah. I have a dual. I have a dual response. One, the welfare state can erode social norms. In the absence of welfare, private institutions may fill the gap, and their standards are often higher. But welfare can actually erode the desire to invest in community, save, and work. So that's a negative impact of welfare. And secondly, industrialization can result in individualizing philosophies that also erode social capital and trust.
Absolutely. And the best example is, for example, Germany, where you have the western part and the eastern part. And the eastern part was in a socialist society where with a strong government. And you can feel this even today, 30 years after the fall of the Iron Curtain. You can feel this that Eastern German people are more risk avoidant in economical questions than Western Germans, especially the one generation before me, before my generation. They are very how I say this. They tried the Eastern Germans, which living under the socialist regime, are extremely risk avoiding when it's come to economic questions. They don't want to make an enterprise. They just want to do their jobs and don't care about anything other.
Yeah,
They don't want to
and
make.
they're less pro-social
Mm,
in Eastern Germany.
that's what. No, I wouldn't say this. I wouldn't say this because that's another factor. Because the socialist regime was repressive, very hostile also against their people. And they have also the wealth was not so high developed in Eastern Germany. So you are depending more on your neighbor and your friends.
Yeah, and David, what people frequently misunderstand about socialism and communism is that these systems erect artificial barriers to human interactions.
Yeah,
So in a free market system, we're able to evade the bureaucrat. But in a left-leaning system, the bureaucrat is a powerful figure, and without his input, we're unlikely to invest or benefit from commerce. And as a result, we may either bribe the bureaucrat or develop relationships with these bureaucrats that are unproductive in terms of their impact on the broader economy.
yeah, I would agree. That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
But
But
yeah, when it's come to the question about having a social state or welfare state or not, I wouldn't. I would reject. I don't want to reject the welfare state completely, but I think it has to be reduced to a minimum. And especially for Germany, you have a very strong, or one of the strongest welfare states on the globe. I think only Sweden and Norway are a little bit stronger. But I also see this makes people lazy and antisocial. And when we're talking about this paper, I have a lot of connections to Estonia, to Estonian people. And Estonia, for example, they have a very less developed welfare state. They are very economic liberal. And what you see when you go there, you see that the families are strongly bounded together, and the people in the towns and villages are living in a very strong bounded societies. It's very fascinating, which they show behavior which you not see in Germany, for example. People from one village or from one town came together and celebrating something without that the government has starting this the celebration. Yeah, when you make some Volksfeste, as we say in Germany, folk festivals in Germany, that's were mostly initiated by governments, and the people come there and visiting them. They don't make this from their own motivation. That's very interesting difference in behavior.
Because in directly and indirectly, markets promotes trust, tolerance, and diversity. In order to succeed in the marketplace, you cannot engage in negative discrimination. So for example, you may discriminate against someone who is not qualified because your company needs to make money, and incompetent people will cause your company to lose. But you shouldn't judge people on the basis of their gender or
Mhm.
orientation in a free market economy. If you do so, you're going to lose. So even during slavery in the Caribbean and the American South, there are examples of white men doing business with black slaves because racists hate other people, but they love money more.
That's correct. Otherwise, I think that yeah, people became antisocial in when there's a strong welfare states because they are not depending many more on other people.
And
But at the
and
same,
David,
but one minute, and follow me one sentence. But at the same time, free market economy with all its benefits it has, I would totally agree that it has a lot of benefits. But this increases the heterogeneity of the society in ethnical terms and biological terms, for example. And I think that could also be very harmful for the social cohesion.
and David, this will be our last point on economics, but in Europe, countries like Denmark and Sweden are often characterized as left-leaning because they tend to invest in statist policies. None of these countries are
Mhm.
truly socialist. They represent the social market economy. They're not socialist. However, according to reports and the World Values
Yeah,
Survey, people in Sweden and Denmark value autonomy. And one writer even notes that in Scandinavia, people prefer government welfare because it protects them from the indignity of depending on their neighbor. So even
Yeah,
though these countries invest in welfare, they score quite high on measures of autonomy. But this is our last point on personality and economics. We're going to switch to your paper,
okay.
the Flynn effect and economic growth. Do national increases in intelligence lead to increases in GDP? David, question.
Mhm.
Is there a consistent relationship between an increase in IQ and economic growth?
Yes, definitively.
And
Um,
you may go
one
ahead.
problem, yeah. One problem is that first you have to define what you say as economic growth, because when you are less developed countries or poor country, it is much easier to increase your economics by some point, some 10%, for example, than a rich country. So a rich country, which mostly have a higher IQ, because there's a positive correlation between IQ and wealth. Um, a rich country would always have a lesser economic development than a poor country, or most of the cases. Most of the cases. So you would have find a negative correlation between IQ and economic increasing or growing of economic growth. Huh? But when you control this for the current state of the economy, you will find a positive relationship between intelligence and economic growth.
So, for example, in your research, it is also observed that this relationship is long term. So tracking economic growth across centuries, it is discovered that historically the relationship between IQ and growth has been consistent. So in the past, societies with higher levels of IQ were also more likely to grow.
Yeah, what we are using here in this study is the Flynn effect, so the increases in intelligence. And what we find in this paper was that um, there is a positive relationship between periods of time in a country where the Flynn effect was observing or intelligence growth for a certain amount, and uh, increase in economic growth, but with a delay of around 10 years. That makes totally sense because um, because when people measured on IQ and so on, they are mostly young people, mostly pupils, for example, or school children. And they need some time, around 10 years, to come from school to training and then to economy. So you have a lack of 10 years before a person which is schooled now will have can contribute to economy. And that's exactly what we find. The relationship between these cognitive growth and economic growth increases when we looking 5 years later and 10 years later, but then starting to decrease when we look 15 years later and 20 years later. One point I have to make here that it's not really known if the Flynn effect is a real increase in intelligence, but maybe only an increase in education and knowledge. For example, it's also Michael Woodley said this, and some others said this also, that the Flynn effect is nothing more than a restructuring of human intelligence toward intelligence as tasks. So intelligence, the general intelligence, the underlying factor didn't increase. Maybe it's decreased over time, but the structure of intelligence changes so that it's better fit to tasks in from intelligence tests. So we learn to make intelligent, or we develop to make intelligence tests better, but without increasing our intelligence.
Okay, so so well the debate is interesting. Some argue that the Flynn effect is a consequence of both genetic and environmental factors, but recent research is showing that the Flynn effect is not necessarily accounting for general ability.
No, no. We made a survey in 2013-14 about experts from the field of intelligence research, and we also asked them about causes of differences in intelligence, and we ask him about the causes, possible causes for the Flynn effect. And when you correlate these factors, you see that first you see that the levels of intelligence in the question of what causes the levels of intelligence, there are many people saying, okay, genes have a important role. But when you ask about Flynn effect, they say, oh no, it's environment. And when you correlate the results for all these factors, you find a negative correlation. So the Flynn effect is in their opinion, the causes of the Flynn effect are the opposite than for the for intelligence itself. So, and also that would support the theory of Michael Woodley and some others that the Flynn effect is not an increase in general intelligence, but only a switch in or changing in the structure of intelligence.
All right. But in relation to your paper, there's another pressing issue that we will discuss. IQ is context dependent. So, for example, in 1900, the average IQ of America was lower. Today, America has a high. Today, America IQ is higher, but in 1900, America was on its way to becoming a world power. Therefore, the point being elucidated is that even in the context of an era where IQs on average are lower at the global level, countries with higher IQs will still do better.
Yeah. At first, this is the same topic we have some minutes ago when I talk about Woodley's opinion about the 1900s. So maybe this we see the Flynn effect when we measured intelligence. We see that today they are much more intelligent than 100 years ago. But this is what the test said. Maybe the general intelligence behind, which could not be directly measured, but just by other factors, estimated by other factors, that the general intelligence was higher in 1900 than today. That's the opinion of Mike Woodley and some others. And the other point is that you have to look who is most important for economic growth. Is it the whole population or is it just the elite?
The smart fraction is extremely pivotal.
It was the result from the work of Heinz Lindemann. It shows that the elite, the top 5%, are much more important because they make the inventions. Yeah. They make the inventions and the important decisions. So what you also have for example, in Western countries, and you also see this in Germany again, that people studying on university are not longer the cognitive elite. Yeah, many people today studying at universities in Germany wouldn't be allowed to access a university in 1900.
Exactly. So my argument is that though the national level of intelligence based on IQ was lower in the past, the smart fraction was smarter.
Yeah, it's for example in Germany we have the two schools, the regular school and the we may call it Abitur or Gymnasium, which is the A level in Great Britain. I think some decades ago there are less than 10% who are going to the A level and have then access to higher education and universities. Today it's 30%. 30% of the 40% of the whole population making the A level. So it's not, as I said, education becomes more equalized, but not improved. So you would say you have a kind of inflation, educational inflation.
But David, you and Michael Lynn co-authored a paper explaining the anti-Flynn effect, and in that paper you made reference to environmental factors such as certain chemicals. So briefly tell us what is explaining the anti-Flynn effect. What's behind it?
The anti-Flynn effect, and that's interesting. I don't like the word anti-Flynn effect. I said it because anti-Flynn effect would, when you say anti-Flynn effect, you think that it's the reversal of the Flynn effect, but it's not the reversal. It's a completely different effect. and this is mostly caused by genetic factors. And this is also what we find when we asking the experts. That's again, the experts rated the factors for a possible anti-Flynn effect, exactly the opposite, so genetic more than environment, then up when we're asking for the Flynn effect.
And what are these genetic factors?
The genetic factor, I think that's cumulative, kind of mutation, though, I say, or a selection against IQ.
Oh, in other words, dysgenics.
Yeah, dysgenics. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, just get to the point here. Less intelligent people are passing on genes with mutation than they don't necessarily code for intelligence.
Yeah,
that's what's going on. And what's the relationship between lead and intelligence, for example? Many contend that lead is affecting intelligence negatively.
Yeah, they say this, but it's nonsense, because all these toxic substances which could harm intelligence extremely decreased in our society from in the last 100 years. So they couldn't there is no increase in toxic chemicals and so on, like lead and mercury, for example, is another factor. There is no decrease in these factors. So you can't say that this is the cause of the decline of intelligence. That's nonsense.
All right.
What Michael showed, that the frequency of intelligence-associated genes, that these decreased over the last 100 years.
Yes.
That could be predicted the anti-Flynn effect.
And now we can get to your paper on cognitive sex differences. David, on average, are men more intelligent than women?
On average, yes.
Okay, and why is this so?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. We try to answer this in this article. You can say that's from an evolutionary perspective. That's a genetic. This was supported, or let's say so. Richard Lynn has this developmental theory, so that differences, sex differences, intelligence are increased with age. And what we find, I think this was a really interesting paper.
Yes, it was very interesting, because you compared Germany and Brazil, to different countries, and you found the same result.
Yeah, this was the part mostly by Mr. Winterman done. I was more for the genetic or for the developmental part. What I was what's really interesting to find out, that the differences in intelligence increased, and they're starting to increase with puberty. In this time, exactly that time, when men and women starting to have different roles in society. So people can getting hunting in Stone Age, or later working, and women married and get pregnant and get child and educated their child. So you have a split in social roles for women and men exactly at the time of the puberty, which is it's logical or rational, but at the same time the differences in intelligence starting to increase. And also what's interesting is that when you have some medical treatments, for example with estrogen, therefore when women gets older and the estrogen level decreases, then maybe their cognitive differences also decrease. But what's shown is that when there are some estrogen therapies were initiated, that's not the case. So and the third interesting phenomenon is that you have sexual dimorphism in the brain in humans, and this also starts when puberty starts, and it's affected areas in the brain which are associated with those kinds of intelligence, example spatial intelligence, where you can find most of these differences. So overall, what I would say and would confirm Richard's developmental theory is that it's always a result of different hormonal development. So when
Yeah.
you come to puberty and you are a woman, you have more estrogen and your intelligence decreased slightly. And when you are man, maybe it's the same or increases. But overall, I say that these differences are not so big. Yeah, within the population, I think just below 5 points. But when you are looking at the normal distributions, when you compare this of men and women, you see that men outperform women, especially in the higher IQ ranks. So this ranks which are very important when you are make a scientific career, for example, in this
Yes.
work.
In the past, men were hunters. In the past, men were hunters, strategists, and warriors. So over time, they would have selected for intelligence. Furthermore, David, we must refute the argument that agricultural development favored the empowerment of men. On some level, it is true, but research for several years has shown us that even in societies that are not dependent on agriculture, men are still more dominant than women.
Yeah. Recently, I see a documentation about the some indigenous people in Papua New Guinea, some which are living in the jungle deep, and that's very fascinating. They have one village separated for men and women. So there's a wall within the village which separated men and women, and women working the whole day, and men sitting around the fire and painting their bodies and making their hair. So when you say that's absolutely that's a massive inequality between women and men when it comes to social roles. But when you're looking today in industrialized society, for example, I'm starting my career as a butcher, so not as a scientist, and
Uh,
I'm working in an industrial job, and the yeah more
David, is that society an agricultural society?
is
The society you're referring to, is it an agricultural society?
it's not agriculture, it's a hunter gatherer.
Or
Well, something between a hunter gatherer and agriculture. They have some agriculture in Papua New Guinea, but it's very low developed. But they mostly are hunter gatherers.
they're mostly hunter
Yeah.
gatherers.
So
Well,
it's right that the men are the hunters, but they are mostly living from gathering and some primitive agriculture. And these parts were done mostly by women,
oh,
or
the, the,
completely
prim-
by women.
the primitive agriculture was done mostly by women.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think it's at the starting date. They're collecting some seeds and planting here and there some stuff, but mostly are gatherers. Because when you are living in a jungle, you don't have to make some agriculture because everything grows around you. Why should you make some plants?
Yeah, because remember, David, agriculture is multidimensional, and many roles in agriculture do not necessitate physical strength. So depending on the type of agriculture, the labor of women may be more relevant. Agriculture was really transformed with the introduction of capital intensive equipment. So for example, the plow, although the plow today is not very sophisticated, but some studies have shown that the plow transform gender dynamics. So the relationship is actually between technological agriculture and not agriculture more loosely.
Yeah, I think it's when you're looking at hunter-gatherer cultures, what you have to keep in mind is that when you're increasing your level of society from hunter-gatherers to agriculture and so on, you also decreased your mortality rate. So hunter-gatherer cultures are maybe or looking very equal because you have a less variance in genetics and behavior and so on. So you have a small, very homogeneous society in hunter-gatherers. But when it comes to agriculture, more people survived. You have an increase of diversity in your society, and that's maybe why it looks that the level of equality decreases. But when you're looking at the at the social roles, you see more a decrease in inequality.
Yeah,
I would
and
say.
on,
Agriculture, industrialization.
yeah, and the hunter-gatherer societies had a modest level of income inequality. They were not perfect, as some would suggest.
No, no.
Yeah, and infant mortality was also a problem in hunter-gatherer societies, and they often preferred to kill female children. But David, we had an excellent discussion, and we may have a private Zoom chat some other time. But unfortunately, I have to wrap up. So bye. Yeah, bye, David.
Oh yeah, yeah. Right. What very good to nice to talk to you
Yeah.
and good luck.
All
Yeah.
right.